This is Bruce.
And this is Ashlyn.
Thanks for joining the Life Report. Hey, thanks for joining us. Tonight we're going to be going through some popular pro-choice arguments and discussing how to unpack those and what exactly the pro-life response is and why.
And for the sake of entertainment, and because we all know that Bruce is the real expert here, I'm going to be playing the role of devil's advocate while he tackles actually answering the pro-life response. So to begin with, let's start with the classic argument that we always hear, that as women, we should have the right to the sole discretion of what happens to our bodies. What would you say in response to that?
Yeah, so admittedly, in virtually every sense of this idea, the answer is yes. Women should have the right to control their bodies. They shouldn't be violated. They shouldn't be oppressed. Women aren't slaves. They're not lesser. Those are all accurate things. However, we do put limitations not just on women's bodies, but on men's bodies as well. We limit what kinds of things we can put in our bodies. We limit what kinds of things we can do with our bodies. And so it's like saying I have the right to wave my arms around like a wild man until my arms come in contact with someone else. We call that assault. And so I have the right to do with my body what I want until it starts to impose on the rights of someone else's body. And that is effectively, at a very basic level, what the pro-life argument is what you're choosing to do to the developing body of a preborn child is terminate their life, is violent, is aggressive, is barbaric in many ways. And so you have the right to have sex with who you want to have sex with. You have the right to, choose to eat what you want to eat. You have the right to live where you want to live. You have the right to vote. You have and all those things play back into some of the earliest feminist movement that effectively recognized that there was some inequality between women and men, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, here in just a second. But when it comes down to this basic point of I have the right to do with my body whatever I please, that's just not true. And we don't apply that across the board anywhere else. There are restrictions that we have about what we do with our bodies. And so certainly when it comes to harming someone else's body, even when it is in this very limited sense where I can't think of another time where anybody's ever put their body inside my body and I've gone, oh no, I don't have the right to do something now with your body. It's a strange thing to then turn around and try and make some equivalence out of that because it just doesn't happen in any other way. So we do need to make sure that we recognize that pregnancy is a very specific situation that doesn't really have an equal. And so treating that with dignity and respect, I think, is also merited.
Yeah, for sure. Let's hop back to that idea of gender equality that you just mentioned, because a lot of people focus on the idea that abortion is essential for women to be equal and to fulfill their full potential. That's a huge culture clash. And even I, as a married woman, when I was pregnant, felt that push, like you're not going to succeed in your career if you have this baby. So what do you say to those women who want to have a future and a career?
Yeah, well, I think first off, I'd like to say to those pro-lifer kind of abolitionist people out there who are like, we need to abolish abortion, all those kinds of things, that the pro-choice movement didn't just come out of nowhere. It's not like women just woke up one day and were like, you know what, we want the right to end the lives of our preborn children. And so there were inequalities, and I would say in maybe a much more limited sense today. I don't know that I have an exact combination. In some ways, I may be pandering here, but I would even say there are still inequalities today. In that, when women get pregnant, there is this sense of like, okay, well, what does that mean to my business if I'm your employer, if I'm the woman's employer? But there was very real discrimination that would happen where a woman would get pregnant and she would get fired, or a woman would get hired and the limit on how she could be paid or the promotions that she might attain were set, and just kind of like, you're a woman and we know you're going to get pregnant, and so we're not going to move you up so that you can provide for yourself, provide for your child, provide for your family, those types of things. And I do think that Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, in many ways was responding to the recognition that there were women, especially women in poverty, who were effectively being oppressed and just kind of used as this kind of baby making machine where they just had no control over anything that was happening in their lives. And then their children were dying. And so they weren't able to feed them, care for themselves. And men truly were oppressing women in this way, which I think deserved a response. I just think the conclusions that they came to were incredibly wrong and influenced by things like eugenics, which is a whole other conversation. But that was really the underlying movement that kind of pushed the women's movement into this idea that women needed abortion in order to be equal. And some of my pro-life feminist kind of friends who have spoken out on this, have said things like, look, if our equality has to mean the death of our children, that's not really equality. And I think that's a great way to summarize the concept there. I think additionally, what needs to be recognized is that the way that we think about gender needs to be shifted. We often think of gender in just kind of this one single line where you've got women on one end and men on the other end, or you've got masculinity on one end and femininity on the other end. And that's just not the case. We've got two lines. There are two genders, and we've got sort of a more creative and then a more rough and tumble kind of version of masculinity. That often gets lost in sort of the creatives are then, somehow more feminine, and then they must be gay. We get into like that weird argument. And then the masculine is sort of like you can't be compassionate or feeling or have emotions. And then down here, we have it almost kind of flipped where it's like, if a woman's very feeling and sensitive, then she's a woman. And if she's more rough and tumble or she's a tomboy, then she's a lesbian. And so it's just kind of lost on me that we've gone that direction. But I think we can easily just go back to Genesis 3, where we see the fall, where we see Adam and Eve standing there side by side, and God said, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Adam standing passively by as Eve steps forward, and then again passively kind of takes what Eve gives him and is complicit in that whole exchange, and then turns around and tells God, it's this woman you gave me. And so for as much as I want to tell women like, hey, look, the genders are not the same. There are men and there are women, or women and men, if that feels like I did some kind of hierarchy there as I was describing that with my hands. But there's definitely been a sense of men being passive and not taking their role, and then women shifting their role in response, and that leading to the subjugation of the preborn, where we've effectively just kind of gotten to this place where we're not talking about equality anymore. What we're really talking about is who's the most vulnerable person that we can subjugate so that we can meet our desires and our needs.
Yeah, so true. To hop back to that first response you made to the first question, you mentioned the preborn baby and how, you're imposing yourself on it when you have an abortion. But some people don't really believe it's a preborn baby. They believe it's just like a ball of tissues. It's a fetus. It's not really alive. What do you say to those people?
Yeah, I think I say, look, I've certainly been guilty of times where I have had my sort of agenda or my idea of what I believe to be true. And many times that's based off experience. Sometimes it's based on something I learned from somebody else, or, an idea or concept that I thought had a lot of merit. And then I took that concept and backed into the evidence that way. So it's sort of like I came up with my conclusion, and then I went, okay, I need the evidence to fit my conclusion, not the other way around. And I think that's what's happened is we've gone, look, we want women to experience freedom. We want women to experience wholeness. We want women to be honored and valued. And there's been this then idea in that I think we all agree with, that then gets backed into that. It's like, okay, well then how can a woman do that if she can't necessarily control when she gets pregnant? I mean, even on birth control, right, is like a woman can still get pregnant on birth control, even if she has access to that. And so that's sort of backed into this idea that all of a sudden we need to give a woman a right to have an abortion. And then that's backed into the idea that, well, maybe this thing that she is pregnant with isn't even a living thing anymore. Maybe it's just sort of this very nebulous kind of blob of tissue. And we've known since the late 1800s that human life begins at the point of fertilization. When a sperm penetrates an egg, we no longer have a fertilized egg. We now have new human DNA that will never see replication in the history of time, where eye color and hair color and, all these personal traits that make us who we are determined right then when those chromosomes come together and that DNA is formed. And so even prior to implantation, which, again, the scientific community has affirmed this back in the early 1940s. The Carnegie Institute developed the human embryology Carnegie stages, and just kind of said, like, look, we know that fertilization is when life begins. Like, geneticists will go, yeah, that we know that. Often what then happens, going back to that kind of, I've got my conclusion of we want to honor women, we want to give them rights, all those kinds of things. They have natural rights. And then we back into sort of this argument of, okay, and instead of coming back to, we know life begins at fertilization, which very few pro-choicers will admit, they'll then go, okay, yes, we might know that, but they might concede that, but then go, but when is it an actual person? When does it actually have rights? And I've engaged with some people online about that. And it's really interesting how we end up kind of making up our own definition of when a person is a person. I had somebody kind of challenge me on that a while back, and they just said, what's your definition for person? I was like, well, let's not look at my definition. Let's look at a dictionary. And I like to play Scrabble. And so I just looked up person in my Scrabble dictionary on my phone. And admittedly, it's a little oversimplified, but nonetheless, I just took a screen capture of it and kind of showed it to them. And it just says a human being. A person is a human being. And so we know that those little clumps of cells that are multiplying are really not that different from our clumps of cells that are multiplying. The SLED argument, we've talked about that in the past, but size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency, or even desirability, all kind of help us understand what is the preborn. And so I think those are really helpful tools to kind of get there. But there's definitely that sense that I hear from the pro-choice side where they just go, well, but is it really a person yet? Does it really have the right to life yet? And it often kind of leads to a term called sentience, which is sort of this idea of consciousness. But I would argue that we're not just consciousness, right? Like, we're not even just a brain. And so we don't even just feel pain. If all we did was feel pain, would that still make us human? I would argue no. If all we did was just have this kind of consciousness, this ethereal consciousness that exists out there, or we were literally just the brain organ, would we be human? I mean, it would be a human brain that's a part, but it's not the whole. And so you can't have a brain without the rest of the body developing around it. You can't have a heart without the rest of it. It's just an organ, not the organism itself. And what we have in those very earliest stages of development in that single-celled organism is a whole organism all in itself. It's not like a car being put together along the line of manufacturing, where it's kind of like they add some wheels, they add an engine. As we develop as human beings, we really start at the end of that line where the car is already all put together. All the parts are in there, and then they kind of grow from within. So it really is a different kind of thing that I just hear a lot of people throwing around personhood arguments that require us to, again, make up our own definitions and set our own timelines on that. And if we need to concede some points and just kind of step back with some people and go, okay, what if I concede that, a human's not a human until 6 weeks of development, which is 8 weeks of development, which is, oftentimes like women aren't even finding out they're pregnant until those times, sometimes even later. We still find ourselves going, okay, well then she doesn't have the right to abortion. She doesn't have the right to consent to end the life of an innocent human being.
Fair enough. But what would you say to the pro-choicers who come back and say, well, you talk about the baby really well, but you don't advocate for the mother? A lot of these pro-lifers only care about the kid and only while it's in utero, not even once it's born. And what about the mom? She needs help.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, yes. I can concede that and go, yeah, like we should be caring for women as well. We should be caring for the child down the road. My wife and I were foster parents for about a decade plus and are adoptive parents. And so we completely recognize that that there are moms that get into a position. However, what I don't want to do and what I have recognized being somebody that's gone down that, because I think a lot of pro-choicers are not all that different, first of all. So we have some pro-choice friends who are also just concerned about the baby and are just kind of going, well, let's end its life before it becomes a life, and then aren't as involved. So I think that could go both ways, but I want to think the best of my pro-choice friends who are making this argument and would just say, I don't want to be the person, and I don't think that it brings dignity to women to say, hey, I want to just be primarily pro-adoption, where we then go, hey, you're not fit to be a mom, because I don't think that does any service to a mother, to go, you can't care for your child. You should place your child with somebody else who can care for that. Because I know that those kids, being adoptive dad, I know that those kids still have longing and loyalty and genetic connection back to their biological parents that should be honored, that should have dignity instilled in it, that relationship can and should continue where that's appropriate. And so those are some of the things that come to mind. I don't see as many pro-lifers that just care about the baby. I honestly think it's a little bit more of a just kind of a pit that the pro-choice world has dug for pro-lifers to fall into. But I would say this, I think it's okay for pro-lifers to say, yeah, we primarily care about the baby, because that is the most critical point of action that we are taking. We admittedly have way further to go when it comes to caring for the life of others outside of the womb. We have way more to go whenever we talk about sort of going back to that gender equality argument we were talking about before. I don't think child support is enough. I do think there are things we could be doing in regards to like the child tax credit for women who are able to prove that they were pregnant, even if they miscarry or something like that, and take some of those situations into account so that we're just wholly recognizing that this is a life from the point of fertilization. And so I'm open to those kind of conversations and think that we would find common ground there. But it's entirely appropriate for the pro-life community to not go, way down the line and talk about things like immigration and racism and all these other issues that are incredibly important issues in their own right. But we wouldn't turn around to the civil rights movement and say, how come you didn't focus on the feminist movement, or how come you didn't focus on the abortion issue? Well, why did you just focus on the rights of the Black community or minorities in our country? And they would go, well, because this is the critical issue we're addressing. And I think as somebody who identifies as pro-life and working to abolish abortion, that I would say the same thing, is this is the critical aspect. And yes, there are lots of other important things around them that are even incredibly important to the pro-life movement. But it's appropriate for the pro-life movement to focus on the issue of abortion and only abortion, and not get lost in all these other things, because that often leads to mission drift and not accomplishing the goal that you want to accomplish. And so there's some things like that I just think are getting lost. And so it's appropriate for us to focus on this one issue.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of focusing, I'm going to hop back to the foster and adoption you brought up, because that's the final question here we're going to tackle. A lot of pro-choicers are like, isn't it better to have the abortion rather than to bring that child into the world knowing that you're going to have to put them up for adoption or foster care? And a lot of people have these negative connotations with those words and think of them as a cruel, dark, scary place for kids. Like, how do you fight that argument?
Yeah. So, admittedly, there's some hard things that kids deal with when they are abused and neglected. There's certainly a high occurrence of that for children that are born into families where they were an unexpected pregnancy, and poverty is rampant, and there's toxic stress involved in that, and the complex trauma involved in sort of the generational cycles of poverty and unexpected pregnancy or addiction and violence and the coping mechanisms that come along with, and the mental health issues in America today. However, I've got 5 adopted children, 9 children total. I've got 3 grandkids. And if I were to go and ask any one of my biological or adopted children or my grandkids, hey, would you have rather been aborted than be in the family that you do have and had the opportunity that you do have this chance? I can guarantee you that all of them would say, yeah, no, like I'm going to choose life. I'm going to choose life in every single one of those situations. And it's a little bit interesting that everyone who is promoting the pro-choice ethic and idea is already born, right? They've already experienced that chance of life and are living that out and are struggling through in the same ways that we struggle, but are on the living, breathing, flourishing opportunity side of life, not the side of death. And so we certainly have to take that into account. I'm not pretending that the welfare system, that foster care, that adoption is a perfect, that all begins with loss and trauma and tragedy. And I know it all too well. And so again, I'm not the guy who's raising a hand just saying, hey, let's place all these children for adoption. I'm the guy who's saying, hey, that may be an option that a parent should pursue. But ultimately, we want to see parents parent their children. We want to see kids cared for, and we want to give parents the tools and equip them with the dignity and the resources that they need. And we want to see healing and restoration, not a, hey, just give up and that'll bring equality by ending the life of your child, or, hey, you can't do this and so you should place your child with somebody else. I would even say for those that are high adoption proponents that we need to rethink some of that, not all the time. Sometimes it is entirely appropriate for a child to be adopted because mom's just not in the right place or dad's not in the right place. But we could do a better job of bridging that gap and bringing adoptive families to biological families and parents and going, hey, let's mend this brokenness that exists in your family, and let's redefine family a little bit. Of what this means for the benefit of not only the child, but for the parents as well.
Yeah, for sure. Great answer and great discussion. Those are all of the pro-choice arguments that we're going to tackle today. Thank you guys so much for listening. We hope you learned something.
If you want more information about anything that we shared about or about the ministries at Watermark in regards to women and men with unexpected pregnancies or past abortions, or vulnerable children and their families involved in foster care or adoption, you can email the Life Initiative at watermark.org or Family Restoration at watermark.org.